Hello everybody, welcome to Miss Duckworth's classroom. In today's lesson I'll be going through an example of an individual oral assessment for the IBDP English A Language and Literature course. So I will talk you through how to plan and structure this IO, and I'll also be talking you through an example. Okay, so a quick overview of the IO. As you probably already know, it is 10 minutes long in terms of your individual speech, and then there is an additional 5 minutes of questions. Your focus is to examine the ways in which the global issue of your choice is presented through the content and form of one of the works and one of the bodies of works that you have studied. So you'll be looking at two different bodies of work, and then you will pick your extract from each of those. You should have a literary and a non-literary. So for the purpose of today's example, I'm going to be using Duffy's poem Diet from her anthology Feminine Gospels, and I'm going to be pairing that with the Gillette advert or short film called The Best a Man Can Be. Okay, so this is an overview of the poem. So if you pause the video, then you can have a quick read of the poem just so that you understand what it is that I'm going to be talking about, and when I start to analyse it, you'll kind of understand my ideas and why I'm speaking about it in the way that I am. The next text is the short film from Gillette, and it's called The Best Men Can Be. So it's not technically an advert. So the body of work, Gillette have got many different adverts advertising their various products for men. This is actually a short film. And it really tackles the idea of masculinity and toxic masculinity. So it kind of deviates a little bit from the rest of the body of work. But it's very interesting in terms of how it links to the Duffy poem. Okay, so this is just a quick example of how I begin my plan. So you can do this however you like. I choose to do it in a table. So I'll just go through the choices that I've made. So the title and the author, we have the Duffy poem here, and we have the Gillette short film. And I've decided that the extract that I'm going to choose for this particular body of work is just the first minute of the short film. And for Duffy, I'm going to have the full poem. Now do remember that you can have up to 40 lines for your extract, and if it is a multimedia extract, then you can also have your stills to support what you're saying. You can analyse the stills as well. But I've chosen just to have the first minute. Now there actually isn't 40 lines of speech or dialogue or lines in that first minute, but actually when I started to analyse the first minute of the advert, I realised that it was so rich in terms of what I could say, that there was so much to be said in the first minute, in terms of what was happening on screen, and also the different stills and the different sound effects or the background. So there was just so much to mention. So I've chosen actually not to use the full 40 lines, and there isn't really 40 lines in the whole short film anyway, but it's actually rich in other ways. And for the poem, I'm using the full poem, okay? So with a poem, you probably can go slightly over the 40 lines, but it actually isn't going to be the full poem. The selection that I've chosen is actually from the first half, because again, once I started to analyse, it's so rich in what I could say that then I decided to kind of make it a little bit shorter than I originally intended. And that's something that you should do yourself when you are planning. So you may decide on a particular extract, and then you may decide that actually you don't need all of it, and that's absolutely fine, because especially with poetry, there's so much that you can say in terms of language and techniques and imagery that you may find that you don't need to keep talking about lots of different examples, that maybe 3 is enough. So then I looked at the different fields of inquiry. So you don't have to use the fields of inquiry given by IB. It's merely a suggestion. But I actually quite liked the culture, identity and community one, because I felt that actually within both of these two texts, there really was the idea of how identity is constructed through gender and how it's been perpetuated through the media. So I decided that actually this field of inquiry was perfect for what I wanted to talk about. And then just note that once you've kind of got your umbrella field of inquiry, then you need to hone it down, and then you need to specifically say what global issue that is that you are going to be looking at is. So before I decided to hone it down and really kind of decide on my specific global issue and then devise my thematic statement, I just made a few lists a few notes here in the different boxes. So I just wanted to think about what could I see in the non-literary, and what could I see in the literary. And actually there's quite a lot of similarities. So as I was making the notes, I thought, actually, well, yeah, I can see that in the Duffy poem as well. So do kind of think about what you see and how it kind of manifests itself in both. So from this plan, I then kind of did an even more detailed plan. So then I went to my global issue in the middle, which is gender identity, because that's kind of the main overarching global issue that linked them together. And then I just tried to look at each text by itself and think, okay, can I see this particular global issue of gender identity in Duffy, and how can I see it in the Gillette ad? And I just made a list of different things, and these then will become the things that I start to look for when I analyse my extracts in depth. And then from that, once I'd made all these notes, I could then, in a much better way, decide on my thematic statement. So from all of this, my thematic statement is, the global issue I will focus on is how the gender expectations placed upon men and women in society affects the construction of identity. So when you do create your thematic statement, just note the key words or the key ideas that you are then presenting. So mine are gender expectations, society, and the construction of identity, which is my global issues, how identity is constructed through the expectations of society. So this now is what I'm going to use to further analyse my texts. Okay, so once you have your thematic statement, you're just going to go back through your extracts and you're going to start to find evidence to support it. It's just the same as a written essay, and it's probably better for you to just think of it as a verbal essay and approach it in that way, especially when you're planning out your ideas. So now what I'm going to do, you go back to your extracts, you're looking for points and you're looking for evidence. So this is just a bit of an example of what I started to do. So on the right hand side here, you have the different points that I felt that I wanted to talk about in my individual oral. So the first one is the use of idioms, because they reinforce the different ideas that women have about themselves and the different ideas that are perpetuated throughout society. So I've highlighted it so it's easy for you to see kind of how I'm linking it back to the extract. And please don't forget that your marks are based on how you are linking your ideas back to the global issue, but also how you are selecting relevant evidence from your extracts and then analysing authorial choice. So the use of idioms is authorial choice. So these are my points, this is the authorial choice, and then I'll develop that later and start to analyse it when I do an even more in-depth plan. So as you can see here, I've got 3 different points that I want to speak about. At the moment, I'm thinking of 3, but again, if I was doing this for real, what I would do is I would maybe plan it out, do a practice and kind of assess my timing. If you're spot on, roughly around 5 minutes, then you're absolutely fine. If you're a little bit less, then you may need another point. If you're a little bit more, then you need to really think about how many points that you have. So I'm starting off with 3 and just going to see where that will take me. And down here, I've just got a little box just to remind you of the things that you do need to constantly think about as you're annotating your extracts and as you're planning your response. So you need to have your points. So if we look at number 2 here, the pressure to conform to expectations placed upon women and the desire for perfection. This is a point that I'm going to explore further in my oral. And then the evidence. So the evidence over here is colour coordinated. It's also in purple. And then your authorial choice, so the techniques that have been used. Analysis and interpretation, links to the global issue and back to my thematic statement, and then link to the wider body of work. So all of these will actually come once I start to do a more detailed plan, but they're just in the back of my mind because those are things that I really need to consider in order to get the best marks that I possibly can. Okay, so text 2 is the Gillette ad or the short film. And these are just the main things that I think I'm going to use. So as I said to you, actually I'm not using an awful lot of the dialogue or the speech here. There's only a few lines really. And then I've got these stills. So I'm going to start with the close-up of different men that are looking in the mirror. There's several different men, different ages and different races. And then it moves to this recognizable slogan and then the jingle that they have. So the jingle and the music that we often associate with Gillette. So when you hear it, then you know that what comes next is the best a man can get. And then we move on to these other kind of the action changes, and we have this mother and son moment, which is interrupted by a group of boys who kind of break through this screen and then race through the living room. And then the shot changes to a close-up of the television. And on the television, we have various stereotypes that we can see that have been perpetuated by the media, and to some extent still are today. So these are my choices. And again, I will analyse them in detail, really think about my interpretation of these, really think about why these choices have been made and what the effect is, and all of that will go into a detailed plan. Remember that you can do as much as you want in terms of your planning before you get to the final official planning sheet, which is where you then must condense your ideas into 10 bullet points. But please do as much as you possibly can beforehand, just to make sure that you're happy with your analysis, you're happy that you're ticking all the boxes, and you're happy that you're creating a coherent and relevant argument. Okay, so here is the plan that I have for text 2. As I said to you, I've just decided on three points. One, I want to keep it equal across both texts, but also I think that there's an awful lot that I can say and analyse and interpret. So at the moment, I'm just going to stick to these 3 points. So I'm going to start with the close-ups of the different men in the mirror, and that's also kind of paired with the background noise. You have these news stories kind of ongoing in the background, which actually makes the tone more serious, and it definitely sets a completely different tone to what we're used to from the traditional Gillette adverts. The serious expressions on the men's faces kind of reinforce this as well, but also it immediately links male identity to the negative news stories, because they are about the Me Too movement and sexual harassment. So we already are kind of making this link to toxic masculinity. So point 2 is to do with the traditional jingle and the slogan, and it does remind us of the original advert and the masculine ideals that have been perpetuated throughout that advert. So when you hear the music, when you hear the jingle, your mind does go back to the previous Gillette adverts that you've seen. These adverts are usually filled with male stereotypes. They do reinforce the expectations placed upon men to be breadwinners or undertake kind of male-centered activities. They're usually quite sporty, or they're going off to work, they're being the breadwinner, they're being the father, or, they're quite strong or powerful. So actually the meaning here is inverted because a question is asked. So rather than the best a man can get, it's kind of changed and the question is asked. The third point is to do with the mother and son scene, because it does show fragility, and it's actually quite an unusual aspect of masculinity to present, especially from an advert like Gillette, because we're not used to seeing this. We're not used to seeing, especially boys, that are allowed to be fragile or vulnerable. What's interesting is it's actually interrupted by this aggressive kind of tone as bullies kind of move through the living room quite quickly, chasing a young boy. And then we also have the special effects. We have lots of different blue text messages popping up on the screen, which are filled with familiar attacks on masculinity that we do see quite a lot. And then the scene cuts to different gender stereotypes of men and women on the TV. And then we have this background news stories that are used again to reinforce this idea of toxic masculinity. Okay, so what I would like you to do is just listen to my example. So I'm going to deliver my own example of an individual oral, and I want you to think about the structure of my talk. So what I begin with, what I end with, how I discuss each text, how I comment on authorial choice, how I link to the global issues, and how I link to the wider body of work, and then maybe think about how I move from one text to another. How do I link between points? How do I link between the different extracts? Today I will focus on the global issue, how gender expectations placed upon men and women in society affects the construction of that identity. Society plays a huge part in the way that we see ourselves, the way that we see each other, and it can be argued that society also determines particular aspects of our own identity. With regards to gender, this refers to the roles that we occupy based upon the sex that we are, as well as the way in which we view and define our own identity. While sex is biological and therefore determined at birth, gender does not have to be so, and it actually can be quite fluid, but it is mainly defined by what society deems is either acceptable or unacceptable in terms of femininity and masculinity. The texts that I've chosen to display this global issue are Diet from the poetry collection Feminine Gospels by Duffy and the short film by Gillette, The Best Men Can Be. Both of these texts focus on gender construction and the impact that societal pressure has on this. Together they both look at the various ways in which we perceive both masculinity and femininity and how harmful this can be on our own identity and sense of self. Both texts look at how harmful gender stereotypes can be, but they use different ways of getting this message across, different forms. Interestingly, through the analysis of both, it has become clear that we can see the effects of toxic masculinity as presented by the Gillette short film, as well as the unattainable beauty standards placed upon women presented through Duffy's poem, Diet. I'm going to begin by looking at the Duffy poem and looking at how she explores the way in which female ideas of beauty and the acceptance of beauty are tied up with the notion of what the perfect body is and what this means. Duffy tackles the very common issue of body image through her poem, and she looks at how, in many cases, a woman's sense of identity is inextricably linked to not only how she looks, but also how society says that she should look. Duffy's poem follows the progress of a woman as she proceeds to diet to the point of literally wasting away. And the purpose of this poem is to show how damaging the idea of a perfect figure is, but also to show how pervasive the pressure to conform is, this pressure to conform to societal ideas and what it means to truly look feminine. In stanza 1 of the poem, Duffy uses idioms as a way of alluding to the seemingly harmless but nevertheless pervasive ideas about women that are perpetuated throughout society. The poem begins with the phrase, "the diet worked like a dream," and it's significant that this commonly used phrase, worked like a dream, is how the poem begins, as it initially sets a positive tone, as when we usually use this phrase, it's to emphasise a sense of accomplishment or pride in our work or our activity or a task. The use of this idiom effectively forces the reader to question what it means for a diet to work like a dream. We usually associate dreams with an escape from reality or with a positive goal to aspire to. However, Duffy's use of this word powerfully reinforces the idea that a female sense of self and her identity is linked to this dream of having the ideal figure. It could also be argued that Duffy, she subverts the meaning of this word dream, and she shows us how this type of enforced starvation and obsession with dieting can be pretty harmful. She also employs irony here, as the reality she presents is very far from what we consider a dream to be, and in fact what she actually presents is a very unattainable version of identity linked to the unrealistic expectations of body image that's placed upon women. We can see that immediately Duffy is drawing our attention to the power wielded by society in terms of how women perceive their own bodies, and it's almost as if she's suggesting that women are no longer independent when it comes to making these decisions about their body. She then moves on to reveal the extent to which pressure to conform to expectations placed upon women can affect their health. She highlights the common message perpetuated by the media, and even through other women. And this is the message that we have this desire and obsession for perfection, and it's kind of this goal of perfection that everybody is trying to meet. But Duffy expertly presents this idea at the beginning of stanza 2 through the use of a run-on line. She starved on, stayed in, stared in, the mirror, svelter, slimmer. The use of asyndetic lists that spans both two lines shows how the woman's rushing towards an altered definition of herself. And the use of asyndenton shows how overcome she is with this process of becoming a brand new person, a person whose identity is defined by her body and what she looks like. And in addition, the lack of conjunctions across both lines could also symbolise the lack of control that she now has over her own body and also over her own female identity, and could also suggest that she's a bit like a zombie in her adherence to this diet. She just mindlessly follows it. This idea is also further reinforced by the alliteration and the consonants, as the repetition of sounds shows how this is a continuous, almost unending process or pursuit of an unattainable idea. Through the use of alliteration and consonants, we also get this impression that her obsession with the diet's taken over her life and her identity. But in addition, this list kind of acts as a barrage on the reader, further highlighting the overwhelming effects of such a diet. Duffy then repeats this idea, and she repeats the idea that this kind of image and lifestyle that's presented in society, which is something to aspire to and desire, But she points out that in fact it results in a loss of identity rather than being something that we should aspire to. And actually, rather than being a desire, it results in a deterioration of the self. Duffy presents the woman in the poem as anorexia's true daughter, a slip of a girl, a shadow dwindling away. And the use of personification of anorexia here is kind of oxymoronic, as the suggestion is that anorexia is in fact the woman's mother. However, the words we usually associate with a mother, such as caring, nurturing, loving, are indeed at odds with our understanding of what this disease anorexia is. It's also implied here that anorexia is idealised and that the ideal role is to be anorexia's daughter. That's the role that women should occupy, and then their goal will have been met. Duffy then continues to highlight this deterioration of the woman through further idioms. She uses a slip of a girl, and then she uses a metaphor of a shadow, clearly showing the deterioration of the woman as she then becomes the height of a thimble. I think that maybe Duffy is referring to the idea that women are very much excluded from many decisions made about themselves, what it means to be an ideal woman, and actually we must be small and insignificant and almost invisible in the way that we present ourselves. This could also link back to the main aims of the collection of feminine gospels, which is to look at how marginalised women have been and how they've had a lack of voice and a role throughout history. She also highlights this feminine struggle with our own identity, and as the woman diminishes in stature, it could be argued that her grasp on her own sense of worth equally diminishes. And this particular poem accurately reinforces some of the main ideas in the collection Feminine Gospels, and it's quite closely linked to other poems such as Beautiful, which also looks at the effect of societal expectations on female identity and also the ways in which women have been objectified and controlled throughout history. The Gillette short film also looks at how problematic this construction of identity can be, but it looks at this from a different view. It takes a male perspective, and it tries to present and evaluate not only the effects of toxic masculinity on individual identity, but also on the wider society. And whereas Duffy chooses to convey her ideas through poetry, Gillette decide to present their ideas in what is common to them and what we expect from them, which is a media text. And as it is designed for TV, it probably would be much more accessible than Duffy's poem, and therefore probably would reach a wider audience. Now, the extract I'll be looking at is taken from the first minute of this short film. And the clip actually begins with close-ups of different men looking in the mirror, which is symbolic actually of how most Gillette adverts begin, men looking in the mirror and then they begin to shave and use the Gillette products. However, these men, they look concerned, they look contemplative, some actually look visibly upset, and we have a range of different ages and races to show that actually this is a message for all men. And it's almost as if through looking at themselves in the mirror, these men are questioning themselves and their own identity right at the beginning of this short film. We also have in the background noises of the news on maybe the TV or the radio, and this kind of overlaps with the images and suggests that they're almost like an internal monologue for the men. And it also shows how inextricably linked to masculine identity these issues have become. Because the background, we have bullying and the Me Too movement against sexual harassment and toxic masculinity. These phrases are thrown around in the background, and so they are definitely linked to the male faces that we see looking in the mirror. In addition, the use of a recognisable slogan and jingle is then used. So we move from the male faces to the logo of Gillette with the underlining "the best a man can get." This does remind us of the original Gillette ads, which did indeed perpetuate male stereotypes, and they presented men in a variety of stereotypical roles. As a nod towards this, the logo and a past TV advert is placed on a cinema screen, but this is then torn apart as a group of boys run through and they tear the screen in two. And as they do this, the narrator asks the question, "Is it?" So the voiceover begins with, "Is this the best a man can get?" The boys move through the screen, effectively tearing it, and then he adds, "Is it?" The image that's destroyed is that of a woman kissing a man's freshly shaven cheek, and again it's a common image associated with Gillette, suggests that using their product will make you attractive but also dominant as women bestow caresses on you. And in addition, the use of the question "Is it?" At this particular moment links back to the purpose of the advert, which is to force us to question all of our views of masculinity and what it means to be a man. And this is something that Gillette has also kind of added to throughout the years, which maybe is why they've decided to counteract this with this particular short film. As the boys then pile through the torn cinema screen, the Gillette theme music is drowned out by the sound of this group of boys chasing an individual boy, and a mob mentality is suggested as by the jeers and the shouts, and the fact that we see the boy running away in fear. He's a schoolboy, he has a school bag, which then reminds us that masculine identity is formed very early on and is often the motivating factor when it comes to bullying. And as if to reinforce this idea, the text message of freak pops up on the screen, which actually sets this image in the modern day rather than this romantic idea of masculinity that's been laid out in the previous adverts of maybe the 80s or the 90s. And in addition, this word freak reminds us of the many ways in which boys who do not adhere to masculine stereotypes are bullied or penalised by their peers in society. However, this scene is then brought to life, and the clear victimisation of one boy by a large group is actually difficult for the audience to watch, and it brings the reality of the situation to all of us that are watching this. This scene then moves into a living room setting where a mother and son moment is interrupted by the running boys, and we have more text messages that pop up on the screen with words like sissy and you're such a loser. And interestingly, sissy is an often used insult directed at males that don't act in a stereotypically masculine way, and the suggestion here is that the boy is being bullied and is therefore being consoled by his mother. However, the fact that this intimate and vulnerable scene is disrupted by the bullies and their victim who's trying to escape from them shows how this kind of emotion from men or boys is often disregarded or viewed in a negative way. And it also reminds us that not only are boys not allowed to cry, but they're also dissuaded from revealing emotion or showing weakness. And the fact that this moment is between a mother and a young son shows just how binary these ideas about identity really are, and how rigid they are. Boys must behave in this way and girls must behave in this way, and it shows how irrational they actually are, as we can clearly see that the boy is young and he's vulnerable and he needs his mother, yet we kind of also know that at the same time society's message would be for him to toughen up and that boys don't cry. And actually, when faced with such an emotional moment, it seems unfair to us, the audience, which perhaps is what Gillette are trying to suggest to men, boys, and also women who perpetuate these restricted versions of identity. So what's interesting about this advert is the fact that it actually inverts many of the ideals supported by the previous Gillette adverts. And the first sign of this is the change from the original slogan of the best a man can get to the best men can be. This takes the message beyond the individual, directs it towards a collective male identity by using this plural of you. And not only is this an inversion of their original message, but they also use different images that directly contrast the masculine ones that have normally been used to suggest this could suggest that even they have been wrong in perpetuating stereotypically masculine ideals through their advertisements. So overall, we can see that both texts attempt to tackle the impact that expectations of gender have on both masculine and female identity. And even though Duffy's poetry collection was published over 18 years ago, it could still be argued that the message that Duffy is trying to present is still relevant today, as we are faced with the effects of social media and peer pressure, etc. And in addition, even though Duffy presents a female struggle with body image, it's not just relevant to women. And as we move into this new decade, it's clear that both men and women face intense pressure to look and act according to societal expectations based upon their gender. And this actually can definitely be seen in the Gillette ad, which was released 17 years after the poem Diet. And the Gillette advert or short film draws light to the many pressures faced by boys and men in order to present this masculine identity to the world. And it also accurately shows how this idea of a masculine identity manifests itself, helps us all to realise the part that we play in perpetuating both masculine and feminine stereotypes when it comes to gender identity. So now you've heard the example, individual oral, do just think about the different sections. So do think about the introduction and the overview and what I commented on and how I introduced the global issues and how I brought the text together. But also think about how I discussed text 1, how I moved through the text and the examples, how I analysed the choices. And then how I looked at text 2, the same. How did I kind of transition into text 2? Which examples did I pick? Why did I pick those? What did I say about them? How did I link them to the global issue and the wider body of work? And then the final bit, which was the conclusion and the drawing together of ideas. So what was included in my conclusion? How did I then bring the text together? And how did I return back to this idea of the global issue? And here are just the final thoughts that I would leave you with in terms of the IO. So it definitely is going to be easy for you to write out your IO as an essay, then condense it into notes and practice as much as you can. Eventually you won't need as many notes. Eventually you'll get used to what you want to say, and you may even adapt it as you go and improve it through the different stages that you undertake. Definitely time yourself. So my example there was slightly too long. So if I was to go back and listen to it myself, I probably would try and decide, okay, which bits can I condense, or which bits can I remove, or which bits can I do actually think I'm saying the same thing. So I would also go back and rethink how I did that and try and cut bits out or improve them. And finally, just keep in mind at all times that you must be focusing on these particular aspects. So technique and analysis, name your techniques, analyse the effect, talk about authorial choice and why these are made, link back to the writer, the creator, director, or the company and what their intention is, what's their purpose. Link back to your thematic statement and global issue. So link back to the keyword that you've already established in your introduction. Do try and link back to the wider body of work and just say how your extract or your text fits into this wider body of work, and what meaning it adds to the greater body of work. And don't forget to link back to the form, how the form affects the meaning, and also how the audience or the reader are supposed to receive the message. And also the purpose. So how do we understand what the purpose is, and how do we react to that and why? Thank you very much for taking part in this lesson. I really hope that it's helped you to understand how to plan and prepare your individual oral. Goodbye.